What does a king become when he loses the very symbol of his power? His arm, his strength, his weapon, his presence, taken away in a single moment. What is left when a ruler's body betrays him, when his humanity becomes a mark of weakness rather than of rule? These are the questions that haunt the story of Nuada, the once great king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the silver-handed king. A question and a fate, wrapped in mystery and loss, rooted deep within the ancient Celtic legends. In a time when gods walked the earth and magic flowed like rivers, the Tuatha Dé Danann were more than a mere people. They were a civilization of divine beings, a race of warriors, poets, and sorcerers who ruled the lands of Ireland from the shadows of myth. But these beings were not invincible. Even the most powerful among them, like Nuada, could fall victim to fate's cruel twist. His story is one of glory, ruin, and ultimate sacrifice, a tale that speaks to the very heart of what it means to hold power and what it costs to lose it. Nuada's fall began with a battle, an ancient clash that would not only change his life but the destiny of an entire kingdom. The First Battle of Mag Tuired, a bloody confrontation with the Firbolg, a rival people who challenged the Tuatha Dé Danann for dominion over Ireland. The battlefield was a dark, heavy place, the air thick with the smell of iron and blood, the clash of swords a terrible symphony. It was here, in the heat of this brutal struggle, that Nuada would lose more than just his arm. He would lose his crown, his identity, and his place in the world. When the blade struck, it wasn't just flesh and bone that were severed. It was the very essence of what made him king. And the cost of this wound was far more than physical. It would change the way the people saw him. It would strip him of his kingship. The question then remains, what does a king become when he loses what makes him whole? When he is no longer the strong, unwavering figure at the helm of his people? Can a king truly rule if his body fails him? To understand the weight of Nuada's loss, we must first understand the world he ruled, and the people who looked to him for strength. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not merely a tribe. They were a civilization steeped in magic, wisdom, and ancient customs. They were a race of gods and kings, their power not just in their strength, but in their profound connection to the mystical forces of the earth, the sky, and the unseen realms. The Tuatha Dé Danann were the descendants of the gods, their name meaning the people of the goddess Danu. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, the wielders of magic, and the guardians of Ireland's ancient secrets. Their cities were hidden in mist, their halls filled with music and firelight, their warriors the finest the world had ever known. For them, the body was sacred. Strength was not just a physical trait, it was a divine symbol. A warrior's body, intact and unblemished, was a reflection of the purity of their soul and their right to rule. To lose a part of the body, especially something as vital as an arm, was to lose one's connection to the divine. It was to lose one's very right to hold power. In the world of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a king was not just a leader. He was the embodiment of their laws, their traditions, their very essence. Nuada, once a figure of unmatched strength and grace, had ruled with a vision to unite his people, to keep them safe from external threats and preserve their magical heritage. He was a king who commanded respect, not just because of his royal blood, but because of the integrity of his rule. His body was a testament to that power. But when that body was marred, it threatened to unravel the very foundation of his kingship. What then is left of a king who has lost his wholeness? What is a ruler without the completeness of his own being? The Tuatha Dé Danann had their answer, but it would not come without a price. They would need to decide, could a king who had been severed from himself still lead them? Or would he become a shadow of his former glory? Before the battle that would forever change him, Nuada stood as a paragon of virtue and strength. He was a king who embodied the highest ideals of the Tuatha Dé Danann, wise, fair, and fiercely protective of his people. his reign was marked by a vision of unity, a desire to forge a kingdom where his people would flourish, safe from the turmoil of the world outside. He had been the first to lead his people after their arrival in Ireland, the one who had fought to establish their sovereignty and their sacred connection to the land. Nuada was a figure of dignity. Tall, with the strength of 1,000 warriors, he exuded authority. Yet there was a warmth in his heart that made him beloved by those who served him. His presence commanded the room, whether in the Hall of Kings among his warriors or in the presence of his people. He held his sword as an extension of his will, and his decisions were not questioned. He was a king in both form and spirit, a leader who carried the weight of his people's hopes on his shoulders. But this strength came with its own burden. As the first king to lead the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland, Nuada was constantly aware of the weight of history pressing upon him. He was not just a leader in the present, but the living connection to their past, the symbol of their divine heritage. Every decision he made carried the echo of their ancestors' will. Nuada's relationships with those closest to him revealed his complexity. His bond with Dian Cecht, the supreme healer, was one built on mutual respect. Dian Cecht was a man of immense wisdom, whose understanding of both the healing arts and the mystical powers of the Tuatha Dé Danann were unrivaled. Yet, despite their close friendship, Nuada's own health would soon become a matter that Dian Cecht could not control. Then there was Lug, the young warrior whose potential shone brighter than the sun itself. Lug was the future, a figure who would rise to prominence in the days to come. But at this moment, he was just a promising youth, one who watched and learned from Nuada. Lug's strength, his brightness, was a reminder of what Nuada had been and what he was about to lose. And then there was Brez, the young warrior whose ambition and arrogance made him a dangerous presence in the court. Brez was talented and strong, but his desire for power often overshadowed his judgment. He had the makings of a leader, but whether he would prove to be a wise one remained to be seen. Nuada had his doubts. He had no illusion that leadership was easy or without its sacrifices, but he carried these burdens with grace until the fateful day that would change everything. What happens to a king, then, when his body is no longer a reflection of his power, when his strength is taken from him in a flash? What does it mean for those who are left behind to watch as their king is brought low? The first battle of Magatuird was a storm, a tempest that tore through the very fabric of the Tuatha Dé Danann. It was a battle that would define the course of history, not only for the Tuatha Dé Danann, but for the land of Ireland itself. And it was in the midst of this carnage that Nuada would lose more than just an arm. He would lose the very essence of his kingship. The battlefield was a nightmare of smoke, iron, and magic. The clash of swords rang out, harmonizing with the eerie hum of ancient spells, weaving a deadly symphony. The Tuatha Dé Danann had been met with the Fyrbolg, an ancient people who had long sought to reclaim Ireland for themselves. The sky overhead was dark with the weight of the conflict, clouds swirling as if the heavens themselves were aware of the gravity of what was unfolding below. It was here, in the chaos, that Nuada's fate was sealed. As he fought valiantly on the front lines, his sword a blur of deadly precision, the tide of the battle shifted unexpectedly. In a flash, a Fyrbolg warrior, quick as a shadow, struck with a weapon forged in the deepest dark. The blade tore through the air and collided with Nuada's arm in a single devastating blow. It was not just the loss of a limb, it was the loss of his strength, his connection to the very essence of his being. Nuada's world slowed to a stop. The pain was sharp, overwhelming, but it was not the physical agony that would haunt him the most. It was the sense of helplessness, the realization that his power was slipping away with the blood that poured from the stump where his arm once was. The king, who had once led his people with unmatched might, was now broken. The battlefield became silent for a moment as Nuada looked at his severed arm, the sword slipping from his hand. The roar of the battle seemed distant, as though time itself had paused. His eyes locked onto the wound, and in that instant he saw not just the loss of his arm, but the loss of his future. The thought crept in. Could he still rule? Could he still lead? In that moment, the king was no more. The very thing that had defined him, the physical manifestation of his strength, had been torn from him, and in its place stood a man, vulnerable and uncertain, watching as his people fought on without him. But would the Tuatha Dé Danann still accept him as their king? Could they? And what of the law, the sacred rule that demanded a king be whole in body? Would the people allow him to continue his reign, or was this the beginning of his fall from grace? The answer was waiting, just out of reach, and the consequences of this moment would unfold in the days to come. As the battle raged on, Nuada's injury became a turning point, not only for him, but for the entire kingdom. The moment he lost his arm, something more than his physical strength was severed. His identity, his divine connection to his people, was questioned. The law of the Tuatha Dé Danann was clear. No ruler, no king could maintain their position if they were not whole. A king's body was sacred, a reflection of their right to rule. To be incomplete was to be unworthy, and in the eyes of the council and the people, Nuada had become unworthy. The moment the blood stained the earth beneath him, the murmurs began. Whispers spread like wildfire through the camp and across the battlefield, carried by the winds of uncertainty. Was this still the same king? Could they allow a ruler who was maimed to lead them? Even though the Tuatha Dé Danann were a race of divine beings, the physical form was still central to their perception of power. A king was not only a leader, but a symbol of strength, of wholeness. And in that moment, Nuada had fallen from that pedestal. The council convened swiftly after the battle, and a decision was reached with chilling certainty. Nuada, despite his valour, despite his sacrifice, could no longer be their king. His injury, his severed arm, was a sign that he no longer had the right to rule. The laws of their people were strict, and the loss of a part of one's body was seen as a blemish, a flaw that undermined the sacred nature of the monarchy. The council decided Nuada was no longer fit to sit on the throne. The scene that followed was one of deep, crushing silence. Nuada stood before his people, a king who had once commanded respect, now stripped of his crown, his position, and his sense of self. The air was thick with the weight of his loss. There was no celebration in his fall, only a deep sorrow, a collective mourning for what had been and what might never be again. His advisers, the same ones who had once pledged loyalty to him, now turned their gaze away. The great warrior Bree, young and full of ambition, stepped forward. With him came a new, colder vision for the Tuatha Dé Danann, one that would be marked by harshness and scarcity. Bress's rise was swift and without mercy. He was no gentle ruler. Where Nuada had been wise and fair, Bress was arrogant and demanding. He imposed labour on the people, reduced their privileges, and harshly punished those who opposed him. His reign cast a shadow over the land, a shadow that even the Tuatha Dé Danann, with all their magic and might, could not escape. Nuada, once revered, now watched from the sidelines, a spectator to the crumbling of his kingdom. He had lost more than just his throne. He had lost the respect of his people, the faith of those who had once trusted him. His heart was heavy with the weight of betrayal. It was not the wound on his body that hurt the most, it was the wound in his spirit. Could he ever reclaim what he had lost, or had his fall from grace sealed his fate, not only as king, but as a man? And what of the kingdom he had fought so hard to build? Was it lost forever? The questions burned in his mind as he gazed out at the land he once ruled. But for now there was only one certainty. The kingdom was not what it once had been. As the days passed under Bree's rule, the Tuatha Dé Danann grew more and more disillusioned. The harshness of his reign became impossible to ignore. Once a kingdom of grace, wisdom, and magic, Now the land seemed to wither under the weight of Brea's demands. The people who had once flourished under Nuada's leadership now found themselves burdened by hard labour, their rights stripped away, and their voices silenced. Bre's rule was one of cruelty, a stark contrast to the warmth that Nuada had provided. Where Nuada had sought to unite and protect his people, Bres seemed only concerned with his own power. He treated the warriors as tools, the farmers as slaves, and the artisans as mere labourers. He demanded tribute from the people, draining them of their resources, and those who dared speak out were swiftly punished. Under his rule, fear replaced hope, and distrust festered in the hearts of the people. In the beginning there were those who still supported Bre. His strength in battle, his quick rise to power, and his ambition to claim the throne had earned him some followers. But soon, the cracks in his leadership began to show. The warriors who had once admired him grew restless. The farmers who had once worked the land with pride now struggled to feed their families. The Tuatha Dé Danann, a people built on unity and respect, now found themselves divided, each person questioning the wisdom of their new king. Nuada, from the sidelines, could only watch. It was a bitter pill to swallow, to see the kingdom he had fought so hard to build crumble beneath the weight of a ruler who was, at best, a tyrant. His heart ached as he watched Bres's iron grip tighten around the people, and the land, once vibrant and full of life, became a shadow of itself. It was not just his throne that had been lost, it was the very soul of his people slipping away with each passing day. But even as the kingdom spiraled into darkness, a seed of hope was planted, for the Tuatha Dé Danann had not forgotten their former king. The whispers of Nuada's name spread through the land, a quiet rebellion in the hearts of those who longed for the days of peace and prosperity. There were those who still believed in his vision, who still remembered the king he had been, and they began to wonder, could he return? Could he restore the kingdom to its former glory? Nuada too could feel this shift. His heart, once heavy with defeat, now stirred with a faint flicker of hope. The question that had plagued him since his fall, the question of whether he could ever return, began to take shape once more. But the path to reclaiming his crown would not be easy. It would require more than just the will to rule. It would require a miracle, and so, in the quiet moments between his contemplation and his longing, the question lingered. Could he rise again? Could his broken body and shattered spirit find healing, and with it, the strength to reclaim his throne? The idea of reclaiming his throne was a distant dream for Nuada, a vision clouded by doubt and despair. The loss of his arm had shattered more than just his physical form. It had fractured his sense of self. He had been a king, a warrior, a man of strength, and now he was nothing but a shadow of who he had once been. But in the depths of his sorrow, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would change the course of his life, and perhaps the fate of the Tuatha Dé Danann forever. It was Dian Cecht, the wise and powerful healer, who first sought a way to restore Nuada. As the supreme healer of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Dian Cecht understood the magic of the land, the secrets hidden in the ancient forces that pulsed through the earth and the air. Yet no spell, no potion, could heal what had been lost. The injury was too great, the wound too severe. It was beyond even his considerable power. But Dian Cecht had a son, Miak, a brilliant healer in his own right, whose ambition and knowledge rivaled his father's. Miak saw what his father could not. Where others saw a broken king, he saw an opportunity to challenge the limits of their magic. Together they set out to create a new solution, a solution that would combine both magic and craftsmanship, a fusion of the old ways and new ideas. In the heart of the Tuatha Dé Danann, beneath the ancient firelit sky, they began their work. Miak forged a new arm for Nuada, not made of flesh and bone, but of silver, a material imbued with its own magic. The process was not just one of craftsmanship, it was a sacred ritual, a weaving of the ancient and the mystical using the deepest of Tuatha Dé Danann magic. They work through the long nights, casting spells of restoration, pouring all their energy into the creation of this new arm. The air crackled with power, and the flames of the forge burned brighter than ever before. As the silver hand was forged, it became more than just a tool. It became a symbol. It was a miracle, a blend of magic and willpower, a way to restore the king's physical form. But it was not without consequence. The arm, though magnificent and powerful, was not truly his. It was a creation of magic, not of flesh. And Nuada knew that, in his heart, this arm would never feel like his own. When Nuada awoke to find the silver hand attached to his body, he was overcome with a strange mixture of awe and sorrow. The hand gleamed in the light, a shining testament to the magic that had saved him. But beneath the surface of that magic, a quiet voice whispered, "Is this truly me?" The hand was perfect in form, stronger than his original arm, but it was a creation, not a part of his flesh. He was whole again, but in a way that felt unnatural, foreign. The people who had once looked at him with respect now gazed upon him with a mix of awe and uncertainty. The silver hand was a marvel, but it was also a reminder that something essential had been lost. Nuada could feel it in the way the people now regarded him, half worshipful, half distant. He was no longer the man they had known, the king who had ruled with both strength and heart. He was something else, a king with a silver hand, a king who had been remade by magic, but who could never be the same. Could this silver hand, this new form, be enough to restore his kingdom? Could it be enough to reclaim the throne that had once been his? And if he returned, what would he be returning to? A people who had long mourned his loss, or a kingdom that had already accepted the rule of another? The questions swirled in Nuada's mind, but one thing was certain. He was not the same man he had been. He had been changed, not just by the loss of his arm, but by the miracle that had brought him back. Whether this was a gift or a curse, only time would tell. The moment Nuada set foot in the Hall of Kings once more, a quiet ripple of uncertainty ran through the air. The grand chamber, where he had once sat with pride and strength, felt somehow different now. His silver hand gleamed in the torchlight, a radiant symbol of his restoration, but also a reminder that he was no longer the man he had been. He was whole again, but in a way that felt unreal. His return to the throne was not the triumphant moment he had once envisioned. Instead, it was a heavy, uncertain step into a new reality. The murmurs of the court were subtle, but they were there. The Tuatha Dé Danann had not forgotten Nuada's previous reign, nor the loss that had led to his fall. But could they accept him as their king again? Could they embrace the man with the silver hand, or would they see him as an impostor, a king who had been remade but was no longer truly their own? Nuada's heart weighed heavily with this knowledge as he stepped toward the throne. His eyes scanned the faces of his people, the warriors, the advisors, the council members, all those who had once stood by him. There was respect in their eyes, but also a sense of distance. His return to the throne was not a simple restoration. It was a question, a challenge, an uncomfortable reminder of what had been lost. He hesitated for a moment, his silver hand resting on the arm of the throne, the cool metal of it stark against the warmth of the room. Was he truly the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann once more? Or had the very act of becoming whole again made him something other? The weight of his decision settled upon him. He had returned to restore the kingdom, but he could not return to the man he once was. The hand, though powerful, could never replace what had been lost: the trust, the connection, the intimacy between him and his people. He was now a king who had been altered by the very magic that had saved him. And yet, in his heart, Nuada knew that his return was necessary. The kingdom needed leadership, needed direction, and with Bress's tyrannical reign threatening to destroy everything Nuada had worked for, he could not sit idly by. Despite the doubts, despite the unsettling newness of his silver hand, he was still the rightful king. He still had the strength and the wisdom to lead. The silver hand would never be his true flesh, but it had restored his strength and allowed him to reclaim his kingdom. He would lead not as the king he had once been, but as the king he had become, a king shaped by loss, by magic, and by the people's need for a leader who would fight for them. But even as he sat upon the throne again, Nuada could not help but feel the question lingering in the back of his mind. Would his people accept this new king? Could he ever return to the man he had been? As Nuada resumed his place upon the throne, a new presence loomed on the horizon, one that would not only challenge his reign but change the fate of the Tuatha Dé Danann forever. Lugh, the bright and shining warrior, stepped onto the scene like the sun breaking through the clouds. He was a figure of unmatched talent, a being of many skills, fierce in battle, wise in counsel, and blessed with an aura of hope that seemed to shine even in the darkest of times. Lugh was more than just a warrior. He was a symbol of the future, a symbol of what the Tuatha Dé Danann had lost when Nuada had fallen. His arrival was a promise, a renewal, a new dawn for a people who had been stumbling under Bress's harsh rule. The light that emanated from Lugh was not just the glow of a warrior's power, it was the light of hope, of restoration, of a kingdom that could be made whole again. Nuada watched as Lugh entered the court, his presence commanding yet calm, his eyes full of wisdom that belied his youth. The people of the Tuatha Dé Danann greeted him with a reverence that Nuada could not help but notice. They saw in him a new leader, a new hope. The world was shifting, and with it the hearts of his people. As Lugh's approached, the weight of the situation fell heavily on Nuada's shoulders. This was the young warrior who could one day surpass him, a man of power, but also of integrity. Lugh's skills, his confidence, his sense of purpose, these were all things that Nuada had once had. But now they belonged to Lugh. And as much as Nuada had once believed in his own unyielding strength, he knew, deep down, that his time had come. There was no bitterness in this realization, only understanding. Lugh was not a rival to be defeated, but a future to be embraced. In Lugh, Nuada saw the embodiment of all the hopes he had held for the Tuatha Dé Danann. The people, the land, the kingdom, they would thrive under Lugh's rule, just as they had thrived under Nuada's, but in a different way, one that would lead them into a brighter future. Nuada's reign had been marked by a desire to unite his people, to build a kingdom of strength and unity. But Lugh's arrival marked the dawn of a new era, one in which that unity could be fully realized. Nuada had led his people through war, through hardship, and through loss. But now it was time for him to step aside and allow Lugh to take the reins, not out of weakness, but out of a deep understanding of what true leadership required. It was not about pride or power, it was about honor, it was about legacy, and it was about the greater good. Nuada, now a man changed by both magic and sacrifice, knew that his people needed a leader who could bring them forward into a new age, one where the past was honored but not bound by it. Lugh would be the king who could lead them into the future. And in this, Nuada saw something he had longed for: peace. He knew that the kingdom would be in good hands. His heart, though heavy with the weight of his decision, was also lightened by the knowledge that Lugh would carry the Tuatha Dé Danann to a new dawn. And so, with a heavy but resolute heart, Nuada called for a council. He knew the time had come, not just for him to pass the torch, but for his people to witness the changing of the guard. He would step down, not as a king defeated, but as a king who had learned that true strength was not in holding on to power, but in letting it go when the time was right. The kingdom, having witnessed the rise of Lugh and the inevitable passing of the crown from Nuada, was soon drawn back into the whirlwind of fate. The second battle of Mag Tuired, a battle as dark and consequential as the first, would become the stage for the final sacrifice of the once great king. It would be a battle that would define the legacy of both Nuada and Lugh, but it would also be the final test of Nuada's strength, a strength that could not be measured in arms or crowns, but in the purity of sacrifice. The land of the Tuatha Dé Danann was once again on the brink of chaos. The Firbolg had not been fully vanquished in the first battle, and now a new threat loomed. A force more terrifying than the one before, threatening to consume the land and all the people who lived upon it. The Tuatha Dé Danann, united under the leadership of Lugh, prepared for war once again. But this time, the stakes were higher. The darkness that loomed was more than just a physical threat. It was a shadow that sought to erase everything the Tuatha Dé Danann stood for. Nuada, now a former king, found himself once again called to battle, not as a ruler, but as a warrior. His silver hand, though a symbol of his restoration, had never been a part of him in the truest sense. It had never truly healed the part of him that had been lost, but it had brought him back to the fight. And now he would fight not for glory, but for the kingdom he had once ruled, for the people he had once led. There was no bitterness in this decision. There was only the understanding that his time had passed, and that the future belonged to Lugh. But Nuada's role, as he had come to realise, was not to be the king forever. It was to be the guardian, the protector, the one who would fight to ensure that the Tuatha Dé Danann would survive and thrive, even if it meant his own death. The battlefield was a scene of madness. The air was thick with the scent of magic and the clash of metal. Nuada, fighting alongside Lugh, could see the future unfolding before him. He had given everything to his people, and now in the final battle he would give what remained of himself. His silver hand gleamed in the light of the battlefield, a reminder of both his resurrection and his impending end. The battle was brutal, a war of attrition. The Tuatha Dé Danann were stronger than ever, but so were their enemies. Lugh fought with the brilliance of a future king, leading his warriors with both wisdom and ferocity. But even as the battle seemed to turn in their favour, Nuada knew that the end was near for him. The weariness of battle had settled into his bones, and the weight of his journey, the loss, the resurrection, the uncertainty, pressed heavily on his heart. In the thick of the chaos, as the tide of battle began to shift, Nuada found himself face to face with the enemy leader, a powerful foe who threatened to undo everything they had fought for. With a final, desperate charge, Nuada struck down the leader, but in the process, he was struck himself. The blow was fatal. As Nuada fell, the battlefield seemed to pause, time seemed to slow, and the noise of the war faded into a distant hum. In that moment, Nuada was free, not just from the battle, but from the burden he had carried for so long. There was no pain in his fall, only a quiet release. He had fought, and he had given everything. The warrior king, reborn and remade, had fulfilled his final purpose. Lugh, standing on the other side of the battlefield, witnessed the fall of his predecessor, the king who had given him the path to follow, the kingdom that now rested on his shoulders. And as the battle raged on, Lugh knew that he had lost something precious. Nuada's sacrifice would echo through the ages. He had not only given his life for his people, but he had given his spirit to the future of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Nuada's death, though tragic, was not a defeat. It was the final act of a king who understood that true power was not in holding on to what one had, but in giving it up for the greater good. The Tuatha Dé Danann would survive, would flourish, and would rise again, not because of a king, but because of the legacy he had left behind. The wind carried the memory of Nuada's sacrifice across the rolling hills of Ireland, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, though mourning their fallen king, found a quiet strength in the legacy he left behind. His death was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something more profound, a legacy that would echo through the ages. Nuada had not been a perfect king. He had not been infallible, nor had he been immune to failure. But in his reign, there had been a profound integrity, a a dedication to his people, to his kingdom, and to the ideals of unity and strength. His reign had been marked by an unyielding desire to protect the Tuatha Dé Danann, and it was that same unwavering will that had driven him to fight until the very end. But it was not the strength of his body, nor the sharpness of his sword that defined his kingship. It was his ability to sacrifice, to put the needs of his people above his own, even when the cost was his life. In the wake of Nuada's death, the Tuatha Dé Danann began to rebuild, to reforge their kingdom in the image of the ideals he had fought for. The crown passed to Lugh as it was meant to, but even as Lugh ascended to the throne, there was no forgetting the man who had come before him, who had given his life for the very kingdom that would now rise again. Lugh would not rule in the same way that Nuada had. His reign would be different, shaped by the lessons of the past. Yet the influence of Nuada's vision would never fade. The people of the Tuatha Dé Danann did not simply remember their king. They remembered the values he had instilled in them, the importance of unity, the need for sacrifice, and the understanding that true strength lies not in the body, but in the heart. They remembered that power was not something to be hoarded or feared, but something to be wielded with humility and grace. These were the lessons that Nuada had taught them, not through speeches or grand declarations, but through his actions, his sacrifices, and ultimately through his death. As the years passed, the story of Nuada became a legend woven into the fabric of the Tuatha Dé Danann's culture and history. In the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the ancient trees, there were those who claimed to hear the faint echo of metal against stone, as if the sound of Nuada's silver hand was still searching for the arm it had once belonged to. It was said that in those moments, when the night was still, his spirit walked among them, watching over his people. His legacy was not confined to the stories told around the fire or the monuments built in his honour. It lived on in the hearts of the Tuatha Dé Danann, in their traditions, and in their continued fight for what was right. Nuada's life and death taught them that the true measure of a king, or of anyone, was not how long they reigned or how powerful they were, but what they left behind. His legacy was a gift to those who would come after him, a reminder that no matter how broken one might feel, no matter how impossible the road ahead may seem, there is always hope. There is always the chance for renewal, for a new beginning, for a better tomorrow. And so, as the Tuatha Dé Danann looked to the future under Lugh's reign, they carried Nuada's memory with them, not as a figure lost to time, but as a guide, a beacon, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of a noble heart can shine through. The lessons of Nuada were not forgotten. The people of Ireland and the Tuatha Dé Danann would continue to tell his story for generations to come. The tale of a king who had lost his arm, his throne, and his identity, only to find them again in the service of something greater. His story was not one of tragedy, but of transformation, a testament to the enduring power of integrity, sacrifice, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. And so, the story of Nuada, the silver-handed king, would live on, an eternal echo through the winds of time.